Hello, thank you for joining us. I'm Jonathan Dunsky, author of the Adam Lapid series, and today I have the honor and privilege of interviewing Lori Banov Kaufmann, author of Rebel Daughter. Hello,
Great to
good
be here.
evening.
Thank you for having
Thank you
me.
for joining me. And first, I'd like to ask you about how you came about to write Rebel Daughter, because as a writer, I'm very interested in how people get ideas for stories, and yours is an exceptionally rare example of how a person comes up with a story and just kind of gets swept up in it. So
Okay.
tell us how it began.
Okay. So I just turned 50 and I always wanted to get back to writing after a career in high tech. And I didn't have anything to write about. And I was at dinner one night and I was speaking with Professor Jonathan Price, who's chairman of the history department at Tel Aviv University
Mhm.
and one of the world's experts on first century Jerusalem and the Jewish revolt against Rome. He was working on a project to catalog inscriptions of the ancient world with universities all over, Harvard and Oxford. This was a massive 10-year project. And he was cataloging inscriptions that were found in Israel, primarily on ossuaries,
Mhm.
their bone boxes that were used for burial in the first century. And I was listening, but not too interested in that. I said, well, tell me about one that was really interesting. He said, well, there was actually one inscription that was found in Naples
Mhm.
of a Jewish woman who was taken captive after the fall of the Second Temple in the first century, sold as a slave in Rome, and freed by her master who fell in love with her. And I said, that's a real story. He said, yeah. I said, well, that's a story. That's great. Um, it just captivated me. And I've always loved historical fiction. But for me, historical fiction ended at World War II or maybe the Civil War because I grew up in
Okay.
the American South, but I didn't have any connection to ancient history. And Professor Price sent me some books. And as I was reading about this time, 2000 years ago, I was just, you know, so interested and curious. First of all, it seemed like there were so many parallels with our world today. It just didn't
Mhm.
seem so far as I thought it would. And I kept learning more about it. And then I wanted to know more. And I got a little obsessed. I'd say I'm very obsessed.
Okay.
And then I thought, well, there's a story here. This is a book that we should write. And I tried to rope Professor Price into working with me, and he did. He was my historical consultant, and he introduced me to other authorities in the field. And that was one reason why it took 10 years to write the book, because every time I had a question, I would have to speak to the world expert. And living in Israel, there's so many world experts here. The expert, for example, on first century Jerusalem was at Hebrew University, and
Mhm.
on children's games in the first century was at Bar Ilan, and Jewish magic was at Tel Aviv. And, I kept talking to all these scholars. And then I also was able to visit so many of the sites and walk on the same streets that my characters walked on. And it just brought the country alive for me, as well as bringing me into this ancient world. So I'd say the inspiration came from just hearing this very intriguing story and wanting to recreate this woman's life. And how did a Jewish woman and a Roman man whose peoples were fierce enemies
Mhm.
find each other? How did they fall in love? And that's what drew me in and kept me going.
And it's fascinating that you said that the process of writing and researching made you, let's say, appreciate or connect more to Israel, because I feel the same way because I write about Israel, even though I write about not so ancient history. I learn
Mhm.
more about through writing and research about the country, and fell in love with it more than I ever learned and did in school, when I sort of took it for granted, because I was born into a secure country. I'm used to it. Everything
Mhm.
seems stable. And then I, I realized that there's a depth of history and precariousness to the Jewish existence, which
Sure.
I knew about but did not appreciate deeply as I should.
Mhm.
But how do you, okay, so you had the inscription, you got that sort of spark of an idea. What made you sort of think that you would be able to create such a vibrant story as you did? Because when I read your story, it sort of felt, I felt like I was walking the streets of first century Jerusalem. It felt
Mhm.
alive and granular. And now when you say that you talk to an expert on children's games, I wouldn't have imagined that there is such a person, there's
Right.
such a knowledge even. But I felt that the lives of the characters were real. And maybe you can tell us a bit about your main character, and then paint the picture of her life a bit in first century Jerusalem.
Mhm. Well, I very much wanted to go back in time and give
Mhm.
the reader the feeling of time travel, because those are the books that I love. And we don't have the framework to put ourselves into a character's shoes from 2000 years ago. It's not like a World War II or a Holocaust book where, you've seen movies, you've read
Mhm.
books, you kind of can picture it. So I really had to talk about, what did the people wear, what did they eat, what was their day like, and I wanted to do it as accurately as possible. And once I started learning something, it would just pull me in. I mean, and I went overboard, I admit. This is probably
Okay.
not a smart
10
way
years is
for.
a long
Oh,
time,
yeah.
yeah.
I mean, I didn't need to spend, weeks learning about ancient wine production and olive oil production and how they made face cream from sheep fat. And I just
But it was
went
very
off in a.
interesting.
Well, it was very
It
interesting to
gave
me,
texture and color to the narrative.
because I wanted the reader to be able to feel like he or she, could feel the heat of the Jerusalem stones through their sandals,
Mm.
as they ran through the streets, maybe fleeing the Romans, and you could smell the spices in the marketplace, and your eyes are burning from the smoke of the sacrifice. And I wanted to be able to put the reader there. And to do that, you need all those sensual details. You need to know, what did the sun feel like on her skin, and what did the light look like hitting the walls of the Temple Mount, all those those details, the tactile
Yeah.
details, I wanted to get right, so that the reader could feel like exactly how you said you felt. And many readers have told me that, and that's gratifying, because I consciously work to be able to imagine it myself, and then I knew that the reader could imagine it as well. um, eh, History is rarely told from the point of view of a young woman or
Mhm.
slaves or children, and it's a different vantage point, and that's a little bit harder to create. But I think it's an important um, say role for fiction, because fiction can take us places where history can't. And that is of taking you into the soul of your character. You're seeing the events, watching them unfold. You're there, and that's a different perspective. So I really wanted to do that. Now, obviously, I've never cowered in my home waiting for Roman soldiers to burst in, but I have waited in a hospital, waiting room, waiting for the surgeon to come out of the operating room. So I know that feeling of, you know, helplessness and fear. I've waited for the Scud missiles to fall as I was
Mhm.
sitting in my, shelter. I've had those feelings of fear and powerlessness. So I tried to tap into sort of universal emotions. I've fallen in love, even though it was a long, long time ago. But those are kind of again, you have to believe the human nature hasn't changed. My character Esther, her love for her brother, her family connections. I'm a mother. I have 4 kids. I know what it's like, to that protectiveness, that fear that something bad is going to happen to someone in your family. So on the one hand, I had the historical accuracy that I really worked hard on. And then I had to take a leap of faith that I could put myself into the characters, and that people were still people. They still wanted to live their lives in freedom and dignity. They wanted to protect the people they love. I mean, those were all human emotions that we can all relate to, even if it was, thousands of years ago.
And speaking of living in dignity, is that the main reason why the Jews revolted against Rome? in
So it's a
the year
really
66 or?
well, it was that, but it was also a combination of other things as well. And it was a question that really consumed me because it almost doesn't make sense when you look at the history that the Jews of Judea, Judea was a small, remote province on the eastern edge of the Roman Empire with no army. The Jews had no army here, and they revolt against the greatest empire the world has ever known. Rome was at the peak of her powers then, with 29 legions of fierce and well-trained soldiers, 350,000 soldiers. So it seemed to me almost suicidal that the Jews who had no army would declare war on Rome. And why would they do that? Yes, there was taxation, and there was all these political reasons and economic reasons that scholars have talked about, the tension between the urban population and the rural population, and the heavy tax burden and the insults of the Roman governor toward the people. But I think at the end of the day, the apocalyptic fervor was at a high then. People really believed that, according to the scriptures and our holy books, that the kingdom of God was coming in a few years. And it was all ordained that they were supposed to revolt because, the end of the world is coming. And it was just this belief and grounded in their interpretation of the scriptures that this was all supposed to happen, that kingdom of God was coming. That Rome was the evil empire. It was going to, God was establishing his kingdom on earth. And that was one reason why their burial customs, which were so unusual, they saved the bones. They believed that the dead would be resurrected and would come back to life when the kingdom of God is going to be established. So there was, a feeling that this was all supposed to happen and that God was on our side, which was what gave them the courage to revolt. They truly believed that God was on their side. And there were some small early battles that surprisingly the Jews won. This small, ragtag group of craftsmen and peasants and farmers and priests, and they won, and they couldn't explain it other than God was on our side. And I think that misled them into the continuing on to rebel against Rome. They just had no idea that Rome would come back and that they would feel the wrath of Rome. And, we all know that it ended 4 years after the Second Temple was destroyed with the fall of Masada, a story that we all know. But it was a time of intense nationalism, religious fanaticism, and we see how quickly dangerous ideologies can spread. And that was something that, reminded me a lot of our own time, the level of civil discourse, and it led to a civil war. There were many Jewish factions fighting against each other. So not only were the Jews fighting the Romans, they were also fighting each other, a bloody civil war at the same time. And the Romans were very smart because they basically waited many years for the Jews to kind of tear each other apart. And then they fought, by making a siege around Jerusalem, which was how ancient armies fought. They always would, make a siege around these cities and starve the population. And so that's actually what happened.
And actually, one of the factions burned the food stores of Jerusalem, thereby making it easier on the Romans to achieve their goals. And what's also fascinating about the Romans is that during that war, it seemed like it took 4 years for the Romans to quell the rebellion and conquer Jerusalem, but they actually stopped in the middle, went off to have a civil war in Rome, and then came back and still won.
Right.
So it just goes to show the difference in power and just military power between the Roman Empire and Jewish society at the time. But let's talk about Esther. Who is she? How old is she at the beginning of the story? And how does she develop as she's swept up in this historical time until the calamity of the destruction of the temple?
Well, we don't know very much about her. The only things we know for sure are what's on the gravestone that was
Mm,
discovered that her master erected. We know that um, it's it's in Latin, but it says Claudia Astor, war captive of Jerusalem. So we
mm,
know, first of all, that she was a slave, because in those days, all the captives were made slaves. They were automatically the property of the emperor. So she was a slave. And we know that she was freed because of her name and the name of the Roman. They have the same middle name, or Claudia, and her master was Tiberius, Claudius Masculus. And what freed slaves took on the name of their past owner.
okay.
We also know that he loved her, because in those years, according to Julian law, Roman law, you were not allowed to free a slave under the age of 30. And we know that she was under the age of 30 because it said she died when she was 25. So he must have loved her if he freed her. And why do we know? Why do scholars know that? Because as his slave, she had to do anything he wanted, even have his children. So there was no reason for him to actually free her unless he wanted to have legitimate Roman children with her, and if he loved her. And also in those days, Romans were not in the habit of putting up, gravestones to their slaves.
Of course.
Um, so also, because it was illegal to free your slave, there were only a couple of exceptions. And the only one that could possibly have applied in this case was, you're allowed to free your slave if you want to marry her. And
That's
so
amazing.
so it was all these deductions that scholars kind of went through based on just the few lines of this gravestone. And so from that, I had to construct things. I assumed that she was of aristocratic birth. And the aristocrats in those days, of course, were the daughters of the priests of the temple. Because her name, Esther, was an unusual first century name. It wasn't a common name. Again, at Hebrew University, there are people who've done many years of research into names of that period. So because her name was, it was Claudia Astor, Astor being Esther in Hebrew, and that being an aristocratic name, I created a character who was not the daughter of a peasant farmer, even though she actually could have been, but a daughter of a priest. And I have her coming of age during the years leading up to the revolt against Rome, being there on the ground, being friends with Josephus, who is our he's the reason we know about what happened, because he wrote the history of the war. Josephus was a very interesting character. He's also a character in my novel, and I had a lot of fun with him because we know a lot about Josephus.
Yeah, he's
He
a
was
historical figure.
a Jewish historian. He was a priest in Jerusalem. They would have certainly known each other because Jerusalem was a small town in those days and people knew each other. He came from an aristocratic family as well. He was descendant of the Maccabees, so he was considered, Jewish royalty. He became the leader of the revolt. He was the general of the forces in the Galilee, which was a very important position in the Jewish government and the Jewish revolt against Rome. He was captured by Rome when a city he was defending fell, and he was taken captive, and he went to the Roman prison camp where he basically switched sides. And he became an advisor to the Romans on how to make the siege in Jerusalem and how to defeat the Jews. And there's been a lot of controversy about Josephus until today. In his time, he was certainly considered a traitor. Now people looking back saying, maybe we should evaluate his role. He maybe realized it was a lost cause and was trying to negotiate better terms for his countrymen. And there's a complexity to his character, but a lot of what happens in the book, or basically every historical event that happens in the book, Josephus wrote about. He wrote about the riots, he wrote about the battles, he described what Jerusalem looked like and what the temple was like, and I used him as my main historical source, as do all scholars who are studying this period and what happened in Jerusalem. So I'd say Esther came about from imagining what her life would have really been like to be in Jerusalem and see what's happening. And she was, an interesting character, but again, I tried to make her historically accurate, because I felt an obligation to her and also to my readers, to get it right.
Yeah, and you did a great job. But about Josephus he's a character that I know even from childhood, because he's someone that we're taught about in school. I remember reading about a book about the city of Yodfat. I think he was captured. It was a
Right.
city in the Galilee, and the Romans came from the north, and that's where the war started. And he must have been very clever and persuasive, because he was captured. I remember that he was captured by Vespasian, who was the leader of the Roman general, and then he
Exactly.
basically told him, or made a prediction, that he was going to be emperor, which happened. And so he managed to ingratiate himself to Vespasian. He should have killed him on the spot, and then he became an advisor and then a Roman citizen. And history profited from it a great deal, because he wrote the seminal
He
book
wrote the
about,
history of
yeah,
of the
of the
Jewish
Jewish
War, and also
revolt.
a history of the Jews.
Yeah.
And he wrote something like 44 volumes. So he never renounced his Judaism, even though he became a Roman citizen. And it's hard to know, was he a patriot, a realist, a diplomat, or was he a traitor and self-serving? It
Yeah.
is hard to know, and you can make arguments either way, but it certainly, I think, showed some bravery to write what he wrote in a time when it would have been safer to say nothing at all.
I
And
agree.
yet he still did want to defend the Jews and explain, the Jewish people to the Greek audience.
Uh, so where the story begins just before the revolt, and Esther is a young woman, and she goes through, and she's a woman living in of course, in a man's society. She's not supposed to have any ambition other than motherhood and and getting married and raising children. But she's a very intelligent woman, and she wants more than what she's supposed to get from society.
Mhm.
So, how did you know what would be, let's say, realistic in terms of her ambition, and what she could actually get, and what would be viewed as something that's not true to the time?
Mhm. Well, there were strict gender roles, obviously, in those days, but it is also historically accurate that literacy among the aristocracy, the Jewish aristocracy at that time, was high.
Hmm.
And girls were taught to read, not peasant girls who would have been too busy helping with household chores, but the aristocratic girls were taught. And there are many examples in the Talmudic literature and even Roman paintings of women holding papyrus scrolls and writing and passing letters. And there's historical evidence for women's literacy. Um, uh, in many rabbinical tales. So that, even though people are very surprised to hear that, it was historically accurate, because actually in the Middle Ages, the literacy kind of decreased. But
I see.
women in those days, there was no prohibition against women, aristocratic women. But again, those were very few.
Mhm.
I tried to, again, I wanted it to be historically accurate, and I wasn't really pushing the trope of this gender nonconformist. I know that's very popular now in women, especially in women's historical literature. Every heroine has to be feisty and trying to enter a man's world. And I really wanted her to stay in her lane and in terms of being historically accurate. And she does want to learn. She's curious, but she marries the person her parents pick out for her, and she stays very embedded in her family unit, and she never rejects her society or her Judaism. So I talked with, historians to make sure that was accurate. And also the title Rebel Daughter, that actually wasn't my title. That was the publisher's title, because again, as I said, they know that that's what sells today, having these, feisty heroines, but that wasn't what I had originally envisioned her as, being a rebel, because she actually doesn't, she is a rebel in the terms that all the Jews were rebelling at that time.
Mhm.
But I think, she stays a very devoted daughter.
She doesn't pick up a sword and goes off to fight the Romans. She's not Joan of Arc or anything
Right.
like that. So
Right.
that's very true. When I read your book, it sort of brought to life the destruction of Jewish society, because that was one of the seminal moments in which turned the Jews from a nation with a land into a nation without a land. This and the later revolt, the Bar Kokhba revolt, and we just passed in Israel. We passed Tisha B'Av, which is the day in which we mourn the destruction of the temple in the year 70, and it made me very sad, because Jewish history would have been much different if the Jews hadn't revolted against Rome and sort of bided their time and just waited for the Roman Empire to just retreat or crumble as all empires do. And how did it make you feel to become so familiar with that dead society, and maybe think about Israel today, or what it meant, the destruction of the temple, which was never rebuilt?
Mm-hmm. That's an interesting question, because it did make me feel a different connection to Judaism. I had never felt any connection to the temple. What do I have in common with people who practiced animal sacrifice? And, it seemed very, very foreign to me. But I think that the message, and I think there is a message for us in that. There are a few messages. One is that what is built, that it takes a very long time to build, can be destroyed very quickly.
Yeah.
And I think that's a cautionary tale for Jews. And especially when we read the rabbis' take on what happened, and they blame the destruction on sinat chinam, which basically means brotherly hatred. They don't blame it on the Romans. They blame it on the fact that we were fighting among ourselves. In other words, we can't be defeated only by outside enemies, but only by ourselves. And I think that has been something that's seared into the Jewish collectiveness, that we can have very raucous political discourse like we do even today, but there's still a line. And when we get close to that line or cross the line, it's an instant pullback, and people pull out the example, even though it happened 2,000 years ago. Remember the temple. So I think it's a cautionary tale for us. Rabbi Sachs, who was the chief rabbi of England, said that history is what happens to other people, but memory is your story. And I think that this is very much our story, because for 26 centuries, we've said Psalm 137, if I forget thee, O Jerusalem. The Jewish people have kept that hope alive. And in many ways, hope is what kept the Jewish people alive.
That's true.
And after the destruction of the temple, the rabbis in Yavne rebranded Judaism and created a new, almost a new religion, from one based around the temple and sacrifice to a religion based on community, prayer, ritual, study, but community based around a synagogue and not around the temple. So I, as someone who had a marketing background, to me, that's like the greatest rebranding campaign in the history of the world, how they took this Judaism and created the Judaism that's the foundation for our Judaism today. And, it's just amazing to me how we keep the memory of this alive. And my daughter was married last year, and she broke, of course, the glass at the wedding ceremony, which is symbolic of the destruction of the temple. And you just see how central this image is to the Jewish people, that we need to remember this event and remember what can happen. But it's also a hopeful message, because at least it's hopeful for us now, because we know that even though it did take 2,000 years, we are back.
Yeah,
And,
we
you know,
persevere. The Jewish people managed to persevere against all
yeah.
odds.
So I think there's a hopeful message as well as a cautionary tale there for us. And I do feel like after having delved into that period and gotten to know it, I do feel more connected to it, and that it's a piece of my history. Whereas it definitely, I felt more detached from it before I knew anything.
Okay, so
But a lot of it is just one other thing. I I can't really intellectualize it, because there's sometimes, and it happened to me quite a few times when I was writing this book, that you just have this emotional like feeling, this almost, it's almost, you as an Israeli might not know this, but the first time, when someone from abroad sees the Western Wall,
yeah,
you get this, visceral gut punch. You feel it in your bones and in your body, and you can't explain, even if you're the most cynical person and you're not religious and you don't think you care about these things, you see it and you just get electrified. And I think that magical transmission of something, the history or the feeling, the connection, it's there. And I feel it now more after having learned more. And I hope that my readers feel that too, that it brings it alive for them as well.
no, even I I've lived in Israel most of my life. When I go to the Western Wall, I sort of get that feeling of awe that I'm in an important in a holy place, even though I mean there it's not as grand as a cathedral or anything like that, but there's a sense of just something um, just something that gives you a sense of awe and a sense of there's something more about this place than just the stones which
Yes,
make up the
yeah.
wall. And I don't know, I can't explain it even to
I
myself
know,
in
two
the visual.
writers and we can't find the words
No,
for it,
it's
but
something
it's
that,
just beyond words. It's this connection. It's
yeah,
this history. It's just the thought that these stones have been there for 2,000 years. My characters could have touched this. They would have leaned against these. They would have seen them every day walking, around their neighborhood. I mean, it's really special.
yeah. So in let's take the progress in the story of Rebel Daughter. So once Jerusalem falls, some of the residents are just slaughtered by the Romans, and many of the others are sold into slavery. And then you move the action or the story to Rome, and you also painted a very visceral and vivid picture of Rome, which I was astonished by, just even by the food that they ate. They ate some disgusting stuff, which I was surprised to learn about, and I won't mention it because some of the stuff was quite appalling. But I mean, it's sort of like a different planet from Jerusalem, Rome, compared to Jerusalem in the first century. It's not.
Totally. They had the gladiator games. They celebrated death and killing as entertainment, whereas, Jerusalem was holy and glorified studying and prayer. And here's a place where the emphasis was on connections and money, and they had on physical beauty. It was just completely different from Jerusalem, and yet Rome was victorious
Yeah,
and Jerusalem was destroyed. So that was a big shock for the people that were taken captive and sent to Rome. And we know now that many Jews were sent to Rome. And one of the reasons that this particular gravestone is so important archaeologically is because it's the first physical proof that Jews were brought to Rome as slaves. We know now that it was the Jews who built the Colosseum,
yeah,
and the money to build the Colosseum and to rebuild Rome after their great fire was from the temple treasury. It was from the money that they took from Jerusalem. And if you've been in Rome and you've seen the Arch of Titus, the iconic picture of this Roman soldiers carrying the menorah on their
yeah.
shoulder, you can see that even today. So it was such a contrast, and I wanted to paint that because it was it was so different. And to imagine having grown up in Jerusalem and then as a member of the aristocracy who owned slaves herself, slavery was ubiquitous in the ancient world.
Yeah.
The Jews owned slaves as well. And then to become a slave in Rome in such a different culture, to imagine what that would have been like for my characters was it was a stretch, but it was, an interesting thing to kind of work through. What would that have been like?
Yeah, I can. No, of course you told the story, but I was also thinking about the real Esther and what a tumultuous life she must have had. I mean, going from aristocracy and then descending into slavery and then being freed and having a short life, but having a life as a freed woman. It must have been something that it's quite unimaginable to think about the differences, the shifts in her life, and what that must have
Totally.
been like. Just for the sake of our viewers, Titus was Vespasian's son, and he inherited his father's role as Roman general, and he was the one who led the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem and then became emperor. And I also remember one interesting story about the Jewish community in Rome, that for 2,000 years, Jews did not walk under the Ark of Titus. And the first time they did this was when the state of Israel was established. Then it was, okay, now we're allowed to walk under that.
I didn't know that. That's
arch, yeah.
interesting.
So
Wow, that's a good
that's a
story.
story I read. I don't remember where, but that's an interesting story, and to see the connection, the pain of that 2,000-year-old history and the sort of rebirth. Now, Rebel Daughter, I mean, Rebel Daughter won the National Jewish Book Award for young adult audiences. Even though when I read it, I felt I'm not a young adult by any stretch, and I felt that it was.
I didn't write it for
not.
young adults, just as an aside. I wrote it for adults, and most of my readers are definitely adults. It was purely a marketing consideration of Random House. I think they were looking for something that would fill that slot, and they call it a crossover, but they just thought it would have more staying power if it was listed there, because then it gets in the school libraries and becomes more of a long-term I don't know, investment for them or whatever. So it was purely commercial, but most of my readers are definitely, I'd say over 90% are adults. And I actually think it was a bit of a mistake, because a lot of people are not looking at it. They think it maybe is historical teen romance, and it's not. It's serious historical fiction.
That's true.
And so that's been interesting.
What interested me, I mean, it's obvious the connection to the Jewish audience, but it was also a finalist for the Christie Award, which is for Christian fiction. And that's
right. That was a surprise for me too.
How did that come about?
Right. Well, that actually, that was a complete surprise to me. And I learned later that the destruction of Jerusalem in the first century was a very important event for Christians, because it confirmed Jesus's prophecies that Jerusalem would be destroyed. And many Christians also are very interested in the first century, because this is when Jesus lived, and this is an important time for them too. And so to be able to imagine first century Jerusalem is a time that they feel very, very connected to. And interestingly, Josephus is an important historical figure for many Christians. I spoke with many Christians who told me they grew up in homes that didn't have books, except they would have two books. They would always have the Bible, and they'd have a copy of Josephus's The Jewish War. So they grew up knowing about Josephus, because he's one of the only contemporary scholars who wrote about seeing Jesus and other figures that are mentioned in the New Testament. So this again is validation for a lot of the New Testament stories that they believe. And an interesting thing that I learned is the Jews did not preserve Josephus's writings. And in fact, the Jews weren't very interested in what he had to say originally. And it was only because of the church that we have Josephus's writings today. It was the monks in the third, the fourth century that copied his books and preserved them. So we really have the church to thank for having this historical record today, because Jews only became interested much, much later in what Josephus had to say. So, and Jews, don't forget, were Christians were Jews in the first century. They were considered Jews. We have a shared past, a shared history. And that they were considered crazy Jews who believed in Jesus, as the Messiah. And there were many Jews who believed in many different messiahs. Again, this was a time of incredible apocalyptic fervor. And many beliefs that I grew up thinking that they were Christian beliefs, turns out that they were very much first century Jewish beliefs. The belief in the Messiah coming and the end of days and the resurrection of the dead, all these beliefs that I thought were Christian were actually very much rooted in ancient Judaism. So we have a shared past. And
it's fascinating that your book managed to bridge both of these worlds because of that shared history and that shared origin, even because Jesus, of course, was a Jew, and Christianity sort of stemmed from Judaism. It's quite interesting, and I was surprised to learn about the Christie, but now it makes total sense. Are you working on another book now, or what are you
I am, but I hope it won't take me another 10 years, but I'm not fast. I'm working on another historical novel, but this time about the 1920s in the American South, a Jewish family. So kind of loosely based on my grandmother and her sisters who got involved in prohibition and, illegal liquor distribution. And, that was also a very interesting time, the 20s. Sure. So that's a fun project. And,
but you did you did enough research for about 20 books about century.
I did, but I think I've left first century. I feel like there are more stories there, but I'm writing to learn, and as much for my excitement and interest and curiosity as for anything else. And I kind of feel like I'm curious about other things right now.
And tell me, apart from the Christie, which has surprised you, were there any other feedbacks from readers or comments that, surprised you or made you view your own work in a different light? And or showed you what the effect of your book was on people?
Yeah, I was very surprised by the reader reactions. First of all, the fact that it spoke to such a wide age range. It also was a gold selection of the Junior Library Guild, and the book was distributed to thousands of school libraries. And I think that what happened is, there is a coming of age story embedded in the book. And I think younger readers could relate to a character who's trying to live life on her own terms. But I think older readers view it differently. They're looking at more nuance, more, the societal breakdown. They look at the book differently. And I know that I've had that experience of reading a book, and maybe you have too, when you're in high school, and then you go back and read it as an adult and you think, this was a different book, because the reader brings herself or himself to the book as well. And it's a dialogue. And I think so much of what you get out is what you're bringing to it. And so that's been very gratifying, to see that it can speak on different levels to so many different readers. But again, I have to say, most of my readers are definitely, I'd say, more in the category of senior adults than young adults.
Well, because the characters, of course, is a young woman, even a teenager. But the book doesn't feel like most young adult fiction, at least
no, it's not.
The little that I've read, which is published today.
No.
I just want to say that I listened to the audiobook, and the audiobook was fantastic. The narration was top notch. I mean, the narrator even sang a few songs, which she did perfectly. It was quite amazing. And I enjoyed it a lot. It was immersive. So if people are interested in the audiobook, I recommend it a lot. And you can find Rebel Daughter on basically every book-selling website, and I'll have links in the description below so people can get it. And I want to thank you for joining me.
It was a great discussion. You asked such good questions, and it was wonderful talking with you. Thank you. It was a real honor.
I enjoyed that book a lot, even more than I thought, because of the young adult tag that was attached to it. But it turned out to be so deep and immersive, and it made me, both, of course, it's a sad story for everyone who's Jewish, because we know the history, but it felt, I sort of felt connected to that period of time, and to our ancestors who went through it and
Mhm.
managed to persevere. So I want to thank you for writing that book, and
Thank you.
I hope that people will read it for many years to come, because I think
Thank you very much, Jonathan.
it's a
I really
great
appreciate it.
experience. And I want to thank you for joining us. And if you haven't subscribed to the channel, please consider doing so. And I'll see you soon in the next video. Bye bye.
Bye.